Hello and welcome to this video on mirror neurons, one of the essential neurons for human interaction and especially empathy. Empathy is a phenomena that is somewhat unique to humans, or at least clear and explicit examples of empathy are. Empathy being the ability to identify with or understand another situation or feelings. Well, based on that definition, most humans. Mirror neurons are neither a new nor especially old discovery, having been identified in the 90s. At the simplest, these are neurons that activate when a person's behavior is mirrored. For example, when you smile and so does the other person you're engaging with. The slightly more complex scenarios have these neurons being the reason why you cry during tragedies, or feel joys in scenes of happiness on television and in the theatre. You somewhat experience, or at least can understand, the emotions being portrayed. Anatomically, you primarily find these neurons in the premotor cortex, the supplementary motor area, and the somatosensory cortex. You may also find them in the inferior parietal cortex. So there's a few different locations, and these all have to do with either the way the body acts, or how the body processes signals coming in. Mirror neurons are not always physiologically distinct from other types of neurons. That is, you can't necessarily tell them apart based on their appearance. The main difference between these neurons and others is how they respond to stimuli, and that there is a particular pattern to this. At least historically, they were originally found in macaque monkeys, which is one of the most common kinds of monkey used in neural research. They found these in the premotor cortex, and then they also found them in the parietal lobe. That's why we know some of the locations involved. Later, researchers found the neurons in songbirds, mice, and, well, rather obviously based on this video, humans. That research, finding it not only in other species but other areas of the brain, was able to then further refine what's happening. And this was done by figuring out the mechanisms were organized in two main networks in the brain. The first is the parietal lobe and premotor cortex, or cortex, and there's plural there. The second is the insular and anterior cingulate cortex. The parietal lobe and premotor cortex are related to processing and, well, motor function, while the latter has to do with the processing of signals. The human mirror neuron system is now not only thought to be involved in, well, observing movement and acting on it, but also in things like language. Particularly important here is the ability to imitate and learn from others' actions. So, for example, children learning to speak. There's also a certain theory that says that it's involved in understanding the intentions of others, and there's at least growing evidence of its involvement in empathy. This is based on human infant data, and what they did was take eye tracking measurements that examined what was going on with mirror neurons before the age of 12 months, and this meant that they could at least insinuate that human infants understand other people's actions based on this theory. Further research looked at the involvement of neurons involved in the mouth muscles and sensory input from there, and mirror neurons for the face specifically. And this was what they were able to at least speculate with much more confidence about, that it was involved with understanding the emotions of another individual. However, this is not an exhaustive system, to be clear about it. Empathy itself is a shared process across multiple different aspects of the human brain, and so it's somewhat more difficult to say that it's just this. There's also issues around, well, to be quite blunt about it, different cultures and different phylogeny, in that not everybody has the same representations of these same things. There are, however, some basic emotions that should be expressed in similar ways, and that would indicate why they're useful. This was then followed up with further research in sex differences. Admittedly, this could be considered controversial, but the research at least backs up the basis of the statement. That is, there are differences in the neurophysiology between males and females when it comes to mirror neurons and empathy. Notably, that female participants had stronger motor neuron resonance than male participants when shown stimuli. There was another study which found that the sex differences based on mirror neurons alone was again reinforcing the idea that females are at least more empathetic relative to males. When looking at this in animal models, it gets a little more difficult, and most of the research has relied on what could be considered observational data rather than direct measurements, and a somewhat harsh study at that. What the researchers have done is take a rat and place it within a cage, and then they've either added some sort of shocking apparatus to the cage or similar. Then the second rat was put in another cage to watch this, and what the rat experienced was that whenever a laser was shone on the rat in the first cage, it would be shocked. This meant that the rat that was in the second cage learned that laser equals pain and discomfort. Then, whenever they shone a laser on the first rat that would have been shocked under normal circumstances, the second rat reacted, even if the first rat was not shocked, as they had, for lack of a better way of phrasing this, been trained to understand that this causes pain to them. The same response did not occur when they had tried to condition rats to respond to sound, so it was a purely visual phenomena. This is what has contributed to not only knowledge about these species that have these mirror neurons, but to a certain extent where they're located and how they work to a degree. In humans, it's a little more difficult, and partly because, brain scans and rather invasive surgery to get measurements of neurons in an infant is, frowned upon, and the second is that, it's kind of hard to be able to understand whether or not a human infant is responding to a stimuli or just being a baby. This is where relationships to pathologies come in a little more useful, and notably neuropathologies in the form of autism. Autism itself is somewhat identified with the deficit in imitating behavior in infancy, and this is one reason why a lot of autism diagnoses are made in the first few years of life. Other forms of autism do occur later, but at least in this term we can look at specific examples of autism spectrum disorders, how the lack of movement of limbs, hands and so on, or the lack of emotional expression could be contributed partly by the lack or delayed development of mirror neurons. Part of this comes down to what has been described as the atypical activation of mirror neurons during the engagement of certain actions, and this was then compared with control groups, so we at least have evidence that there is a distinct difference between them. Other studies have found that there is a dysfunction, not just a atypical activation, so it could be true that rather than just being unusually worked, the entire mirror neuron system has a fundamental failure somewhere along the way. The role that mirror neurons have to play in autism is also made more difficult by inconsistent study results and a very limited number of studies overall. It's also possible, at least in theory, that due to human brain plasticity, that a lot of studies using older adults, or at least more mature individuals with autism, have already managed to find ways to adapt their brain to accommodate the unusual way the mirror neurons are acting, or not acting at all. It's also possible that through counseling, therapy, and so on, that autistic individuals may have been able to largely overcome many of the limitations in a way that makes studying them and the relationship to mirror neurons that much more difficult. Mirror neurons themselves are, however, not without detractors, and not unreasonably so. As already mentioned, a lot of the studies have some pretty serious flaws. They are, however, at least somewhat hopeful ways of exploring this. The skepticism is largely based on the issues around whether or not you can distinctly classify them, and whether or not the phenomena being observed is, just that, something you are observing, and it's directly related to what it is you're trying to study, or if it's simply a bizarre pattern that we've observed and it has no real relationship to what's actually trying to be studied. And this again is not helped by the limited number of studies, at least in humans. This means that everything we've observed, it could just be an artifact of random brain activity when nobody's really paying attention. This does mean that they're a viable avenue for investigation, but It also means the role of mirror neurons, if they exist, is to provide a direct understanding of the actions and emotions of others without any kind of cognitive function involved. It's more of an instinctual process. By contrast, if they're not actually what we think they are, this could be a red herring and we're chasing it down a very deep rabbit hole that won't go anywhere, and all that we've done in the end is describe a very unusual and interesting phenomena, but not one that actually has any significance, because it doesn't relate to the subject matter being examined. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.